Welcome to the MOOC lecture on concept of freedom, negative versus positive freedom. Now to start with, freedom is one of the core concepts in political philosophy. In fact, since the very beginning of this discipline, around 4,000 years ago, the political philosophers at different phases, they have dealt with this concept of freedom. Say, for example, the Greek philosopher Plato, according to him, the freedom of the individual could have been secured only in a just society. And he has elaborately described what a just society means. So after Plato, Aristotle also discussed about the concept of freedom. To be very brief, according to him, freedom of the individual was in obeying the state and living in the ideal state. He thought that only within an ideal state, the individual or the man can realize his full self and can live in a, within quotes, good life. Then after the Hellenic tradition, it was the contract theorists, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, who have dealt elaborately also with the concept of freedom. For example, Hobbes, in his State of Nature, described the situation as nasty, brutish, and short. What he meant was that in the state of nature, where there was no law, no state, no regulations, in a sense, the individual or people living in that state of nature was absolutely free to do whatever they wanted. But Hobbes described that freedom as the savage freedom and not the real freedom. And he opined that real freedom can be established only in an ordered society with a sovereign power, with laws, regulations, and the state. And that's why the people living in the state of nature, they entered into a contract and created the sovereign. So that was basically the explanation of the contract theorist. And then if we come to Rousseau, the Rousseau's concept of general will also basically dealt with the essence of individual freedom. When the political theorists or political philosophers, they have dealt with freedom, they have basically meant freedom of the individual or groups in a society and in relation to the social authority. And while dealing with this concept of freedom in the society, they have entered into debates time and again. What is really the meaning of freedom? Does freedom means absolute power to the individual to do whatever he or she thinks? Or freedom means living within some rules and regulations in an ordered society to achieve the goals of the individuals by themselves? In the literature, political literature on freedom, we will find that the two concepts, freedom and liberty, has often been used interchangeably, meaning the same thing. We will come down straight to the 19th century and then the 20th century, when essentially and elaborately the concept of freedom gained importance and was dealt by very important political philosophers, and that was due to the emergence of liberalism as a political philosophy. Liberalism as a political philosophy primarily emerged in Europe with the breakdown of feudalism and the emergence of capitalism in Europe. And liberalism was one of the first political philosophy whose core concepts was, among others, individualism and freedom. It emphasized on the role of the rational individual and also emphasized upon the need of the freedom of that individual. Liberalism basically speaks of the liberty of the individual in a society. Now, this liberal philosophy was largely influenced by certain historical events. To be very specific and brief, three great revolutions in the world: the Glorious Revolution in England, the French Revolution, and the American War of Independence. All these three revolutions had the seeds of such concepts of equality, fraternity, rights, justice, and after all, democracy. So these three developments in world history and in political history was a great impact on the emergence of liberalism as a political ideology. It was the emergence of liberal ideology, or liberalism as we briefly call it, in Europe, basically in Western Europe, which led to a threadbare discussion of the concept of freedom in political philosophy. And that was a period ranging, say, about 3 centuries, starting from 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries throughout. Gradually, the feudal order in Europe, in the Western European countries, that was breaking down, and a new socio-economic structure was emerging. That was the capitalism. And a new class, first of businessmen, and then after the Industrial Revolution, the emergence of industrial capitalism. So that was a very important and gradual transformation of the society, of the economy, and ultimately of the political structure. We will come to that. And this newly upcoming middle class, which was named as the bourgeoisie, the commercial bourgeoisie in the first phase of their development, and then the industrial bourgeoisie in post-industrial revolution scenario. Now, they were demanding non-interference of the state authority in the working of the market, in business activities, in other economic activities. So that was the beginning for a demand of a free market and free market economy, an economy which is free of constraint or restraint by any outside authority, meaning basically the state authority, the monarchy, which was still then the most important political structure in Europe. So they demanded that market should be left free, and the market should operate according to its own mechanisms. So that was the beginning, and that was the basic demand of the upcoming bourgeoisie in Europe, that they were demanding freedom for themselves. So these liberal philosophers during that period, they championed this cause of individual freedom, which was basically a bourgeois ethos. We should keep that in mind. And afterwards, when the bourgeoisie, they were economically dominant, and they established their dominance over the decadent feudalism and the decadent feudal lords, they now wanted a share of the political power, a share of the political cake. So what they demanded now? Now they demanded, and now they challenged the absolute power of the monarchy. They challenged the divine right theory, which viewed the ruler or the monarchy, the king or the queen, as the direct agent of the divine power of the God, and therefore infallible. So this bourgeoisie in Europe, they now started challenging this absolute power of the state, that is the monarchy, the feudal political structure, and they were in favor of, first, constitutional government, and that's gradually emerged in Europe, the idea and concept of constitutionalism, and all these concepts are closely related with the concept of freedom, which we are discussing. So first they demanded constitutionalism, and then secondly, they put emphasis or demanded government by people's representatives, representative government. And that gradually led to the emergence of the concept of a democratic political structure. Liberal democracy emerged. The concept of democracy and concept of liberalism together led to the emergence of a political structure which we today know as the liberal democratic state. So that was the beginning of liberalism, which we call the classical liberalism, which flourished basically during the 19th century Europe. And the 19th century has been called by many scholars as the liberal century in Europe, and the basic most important political philosophers who advocated this classical liberalism, to name a few of them, most prominent of them, they were John Locke, John Stuart Mill, Kant, and many others. So that was the beginning of classical liberalism. Now these early liberals, or the classical liberals, they basically viewed freedom or liberty as a kind of a natural right of the individual. We can remember in this context Locke's theory of natural rights. So again, rights and freedom are closely interrelated with one another. So the early liberals or the classical liberals, John Locke and others, they emphasized on this natural entitlement of the individual. They viewed freedom as a natural right. Later on, the modern liberals or the 20th century liberals, they emphasized on freedom, or they viewed freedom as the capability of the individual, their ability to fulfill their needs and demands, to develop their inner potentialities, and to reach the goals of their life. They viewed freedom in this way because individualism, which is a core concept of liberal philosophy, that views individual basically as a rational animal, that man is always guided by reason, and it is this reason which helps him to judge what is good or what is bad for himself or herself. And that is why they emphasized that freedom basically means the ability, the capability of the individual to apply his or her reason and to fulfill his inner potentials, the needs of his or her life, and the goals one wants to pursue. So that was a basically different views of looking at freedom by the classical liberals and the later liberals, liberals of the 20th century, who have been called modern liberals also. Now we should also keep in mind that liberal philosophy as a whole, or liberal political thinkers, they in general have not viewed freedom or liberty as absolute. They were against absolute freedom of the individual. And in this context, we should mention that there is a distinction between liberty and license. When liberty becomes absolute, it no longer remains liberty, it is transformed into license. And in this context, we should mention the seminal works by John Stuart Mill on liberty, which was published in 1859. And on this seminal work, J.S. Mill elaborately dealt with this difference between liberty and license. When liberty becomes absolute, when an individual enjoys absolute freedom, that transforms into a license, and that becomes harmful to other fellow individuals living in the society. And in this context, J.S. Mill made a distinction between two kinds of activities which an individual generally pursues in a society as a member of the society. One he termed as, within quotes, self-regarding activities or self-regarding actions, and the second as, within quotes, the other regarding activities. What is this distinction between self-regarding and other regarding activities? By self-regarding activities, John Stuart Mill meant that those are that kind of activities which is purely personal and which does not affect the other individuals, that may be other members of my family or my neighbors or the larger society. Say, for example, I am hearing a music of my choice in my room. That is a self-regarding activity. That is a kind of enjoyment to me, and that does not harm other people in my family or the neighbors or the larger society. But if I put a large loudspeaker and direct the mouth of the speaker outside my window to the road and play my music system in the stop volume, then it will surely disturb my neighbors, it will affect the others. They may not like that sound of that music. There may be some patients in the next door. So, when one does that, that no longer remains a self-regarding activities, that becomes an other regarding activities, that is some kind of activity which affects other people also. And Mill argued that as regarding other regarding activities, individuals should never be absolutely free, because then that freedom or liberty that becomes corrupted and that transforms into license. License means basically, according to J.S. Mill, an abuse of power or abuse of freedom or liberty. So this distinction was a very important and significant distinction in the discussion of freedom as a concept in political philosophy. Now we will go to the second part or next part of our discussion, that is a distinction between two types of freedom or two concepts of freedom, the concept of negative freedom and the concept of positive freedom. Now this distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom basically depends or basically stands apart as two different approaches to freedom by the classical liberals and the modern liberals, who are also called the social liberals. Negative freedom basically means freedom from something. Freedom from something. What does this something mean? Something means the freedom of the individual, that the individual is free from any kind of external constraints or interference by any kind of external agencies. That may be an institution and corporation. Basically, they meant interference by the state. So an individual is free to the extent that the state or the political authority does not interfere into his affairs. That is negative freedom. Freedom from state interference. Positive freedom means freedom to do something. Basically, it meaning that individual is free when the individual can pursue his goals in society, can fulfill his inner potentialities, can fulfill his interests and demands. That is positive freedom. So negative freedom means then non-interference by the state in individuals' matter. Say, for example, I am free to the extent that the state authority, the police of the state, does not arrest me without any offense. Whenever the state police force arrests me, even if I have not committed any offense, I am no longer free. So this is an example of negative freedom, freedom from state interference or state authority. We can have an example of positive freedom also, that I have a freedom to get a proper housing in the society. I have a freedom to fulfill my desire to be educated in a formal educational institutions. So these are examples of positive freedom which is closely related with the personal development of the individual, the fulfillment of his social needs and desires. So this is the basic distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom. Here I will like to quote from the political philosophers' views about this distinction between negative freedom and positive freedom. Briefly, quote, negative freedom is the absence of obstacles, barriers, or constraints. One has negative freedom to the extent that actions are available to one in this negative sense. Positive freedom is the possibility of acting or the fact of acting in such a way as to take control of one's life and realize one's fundamental purposes. In one of his seminal essays entitled Two Concepts of Liberty, it was published in 1958, Isaiah Berlin distinguished between these two concepts of liberty. In fact, he used the term liberty and freedom interchangeably. So he distinguished between these two concepts of freedom or these two concepts of liberty, that is negative freedom and positive freedom, or in other words, negative liberty and positive liberty. Now this debate about negative liberty and positive liberty or negative freedom and positive freedom basically leads us to another major issue or question, that is the role of the state. Now, as I was mentioning, the difference between negative freedom and positive freedom, I told that positive freedom basically was emphasized upon by the modern liberals, and one of the most important influence on the modern liberals was the ideas, political philosophy or ideas of a very famous political philosopher. He was T.H. Green, whose time span was from 1836 to 1882. Green was one of the most prominent thinkers who challenged the classical liberal notion of freedom. He proposed that freedom should also be understood in positive terms, and in this light, freedom is the ability of the individual to develop and attain individuality. That means freedom involves people's ability to realize their individual potentials, attain skills and knowledge, and achieve fulfillment. That is how T.H. Green viewed freedom in a positive way. And that means, whereas negative freedom acknowledges only legal and physical constraints on liberty, positive freedom recognizes that liberty may also be threatened by social disadvantage and inequality. So this is one major point of difference between the ideas of negative and positive freedom. Now, T.H. Green's writings largely influenced a later group of liberal thinkers who were called as the so-called new liberals, such as L.T. Hobhouse, 1864 to 1929, J.A. Hobson, 1854 to 1940, and many others. The difference between negative freedom and positive freedom, or negative liberty and positive liberty, is closely related with another very important, significant, and cardinal issue in political science or political philosophy, that is regarding the role of the state vis-a-vis the society or the individual. What should ideally be the role of the state? And the liberals have largely differed on this issue. The classical liberals, who were basically the champions of negative freedom, they were always in favor of a non-interfering and minimalist state, which they often called a night watchman state or a police state. What does this police state or minimalist state mean? It means what they argued, the classical liberals and the champions of negative freedom, that the duty of the state should be limited to the maintenance of law and order in society. Because only state can look after that, because state has the sovereign power, state has the police, state has the army, state has the judiciary. No other institution in society is capable of maintaining law and order. But the state should not do anything else than maintaining law and order in the society. Because if the state does anything else, then that will go against the enjoyment of liberty or freedom by the individual. That is why a police state, a minimalist state, that the functions of the state is limited to some minimal issues, that is maintenance of law and order, and to maintain relations with other states or countries. That much. And what is meant by night watchman state? That has also two senses. What's the purpose of the night guards in our society? They guard our paras, mohallas, or our houses. They stroll in nights so that robbers, dacoits cannot come. That is their duty. They does not do or perform anything more. The state's duty should also be like that. And this concept of night watchman, in short, that was the role which was sought by the proponents of negative freedom, classical liberals, and that is why they argued for a free market, that non-interference of the state in the market also. That is what the emerging bourgeoisie in Europe, they wanted. Now, this concept changed over times, over years. The modern liberals, the social liberals, they argued in favor of an alternative role of the state, that was an interventionist state, which ultimately led to the emergence of the welfare state, which was very known in the 20th century in different parts of the world. And this emergence of welfare state is closely related with a very famous and historical report of a committee, which is called the Beveridge Report. It was chaired by a liberal in England, William Beveridge, in 1942, and which basically demanded for or argued in favor of some social welfare measures, mainly for the aged and poor in the society, because that was a time in England and Europe when the economic hardships and many negative impacts of the free market capitalist economy was coming into reality, was becoming reality. And that's why it was being argued that state should intervene in the socio-economic matters of the society, in the different dimensions of the individual, and only through an interventionist and welfare state can the individual realize his freedom or liberty in the true sense of the term. I was giving example in the course of my lecture as example of positive freedom that I have a freedom to get proper housing. So I can enjoy that freedom or I can enjoy that right. Here freedom and right are closely interconnected in a democratic political setup. I can enjoy that freedom, I can fulfill that desire of being educated only when the state takes adequate measures for setting up educational institutions and give the people, the society, the scope for getting proper, adequate education. So it is the duty of the state. State should interfere through its policies. And that is true in case of my need for proper housing, my need for proper health treatment, and so on and so forth. So my freedom, my liberty cannot be realized without a positive interference, action, role of the state, which is known as the model of the welfare state. So this question of the role of the state, what should be the ideal role of the state in society vis-a-vis individual, this is a crucial issue, a crucial question, which is closely connected with the concept of freedom and also with the difference between negative and positive freedom. But this issue of a minimalist state vis-a-vis a welfare state, that is another major area of discussion, and that demands another lecture. So with these few words, we will end today's lecture here. Thank you.